"Nice car," Deputy Reed Harlow said, leaning into the driver's window with one hand braced on the roof and the other resting on his belt, his pale, silver-blonde hair catching the flat Alabama afternoon light like something bleached too long in the sun. "Whose is it?" He didn't ask it the way a person asks a question they don't know the answer to. He asked it the way a man asks a question when he's already decided what the answer must be, and he's just waiting for the person in front of him to confirm what he's already concluded. The words landed between Damon Voss and his sister Naomi, like a stone dropped into still water, and neither of them flinched, because neither of them was surprised, because neither of them had been surprised by a moment like this in a very long time. The afternoon heat on Corridor 14, heading out of Millhaven, Alabama, was the kind of heat that pressed down on the asphalt like a flat iron, making the road shimmer and bend at the edges and turning the air itself into something thick and hostile and personal, as though the weather itself had decided to take a side. Naomi Voss had been watching it through the passenger window for the last 40 minutes, watching the flat geometry of rural Alabama roll past in long, patient stretches of nothing punctuated by hand-painted church signs and sun-bleached billboards, and she had not been thinking about the heat at all. She had been reading the small laminated notice mounted on a metal post just inside the county line, the one they had passed doing exactly 53 miles per hour, the one she had read at 53 miles per hour, the same way she read everything completely once without needing to read it again. The notice said, "Millhaven County Traffic Enforcement Corridor. All officers operating on this route are required to document specific probable cause prior to initiating any vehicle stop. Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 3.1. She had said nothing to Damon when they passed it. She had simply noted its position relative to the Finch Law billboard 40 yards ahead, with its large gold lettering and the portrait of a silver-haired attorney in a three-quarter pose, promising results in the warm and confident language of a man who had been making that promise for a long time. Damon drove the way he did everything without wasted movement. Left hand at the wheel speed. Exactly right. Music low enough to be ambient, rather than present the way a man drives when he has spent enough years on American roads to understand that how you drive is not just about where you're going, but about the story someone else might decide to tell about you. He was 47 years old and 4 inches taller than Naomi, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that stillness on certain roads in certain counties was a form of protection. Not weakness, not defeat, just the accumulated wisdom of someone who had done the math and understood what the variables were. Naomi had seen the patrol cruiser first. It was sitting in a gravel turnout approximately 200 yards before they reached it, the hood just barely visible past the edge of the Finch Law advertisement, glinting in the afternoon sun, in the way that things glint when someone doesn't want them to be seen but hasn't made quite enough effort to hide them. She had registered it, filed it, and said nothing. She had noted the angle of the hood, the make of the vehicle, the way the driver's side window was cracked exactly enough to suggest someone had been sitting inside it for a while. 6 seconds after they passed the turnout, the cruiser pulled out onto the road behind them. Not with lights, not with sirens. Just following close enough to be intentional, far enough to appear casual at a distance that communicated everything it needed to communicate without a single word being spoken. "He pulled out 6 seconds after we passed," Naomi said. Damon checked the mirror. "I know. He was sitting in that turnout before the billboard. I know." Damon's hands didn't move on the wheel. His speed didn't change. His breathing stayed the same measured, deliberate rhythm it had been for the last 40 miles. 6 seconds, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Not 4, not 8. The lights came on 2 miles later. Damon pulled the Range Rover onto the shoulder without being told twice. Clean and careful full stop, put it in park, lowered all 4 windows exactly halfway enough to be cooperative, not enough to be careless, and placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel where they could be seen from 15 feet away. Naomi had already put her phone face down in the cup holder, already unclipped her shoulder bag and placed it between her feet on the floor mat. Already noted the time on the dashboard clock, 14:06. Reed Harlow was a wide man who moved like he owned the pavement beneath his boots, thick through the shoulders and thick through the jaw. His silver blonde hair cut short at the temples in the way that some men cut their hair when they want to look like they've never had a second thought about anything. His belt was loaded radio baton sidearm, 2 extra magazines, a taser, and he walked up to the driver's side with the particular gait of a man who had never once been told no on this road and did not expect today to be different. He stood 2 feet behind Damon's door, which meant Damon would have to twist in his seat to look at him directly. It was a small geometry of power, and it was entirely deliberate. "Nice car," he said, leaning in one hand on the roof. "Whose is it?" Damon turned his head at the angle required and said with the level and unhurried voice of a man who had rehearsed staying calm so many times that it had become simply the way he sounded. "Good afternoon, officer." And then he reached for the center console in a slow, visible arc that telegraphed every movement before he made it, and produced his license and registration, and held them out through the window. Harlow took them without looking at them. His eyes were already moving, already scanning the interior of the vehicle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this scan so many times. It had become a reflex: back seats, cargo area, center console. And then Naomi, where his gaze stopped and held for exactly 3 seconds longer than it had rested anywhere else. 3 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In the front seat of a car on the shoulder of a rural Alabama highway with a badge standing 2 feet outside your window, 3 seconds is long enough to communicate an entire set of assumptions without a single word. "Ma'am," Harlow said. "Good afternoon," Naomi said. Her voice had the temperature of someone reading a weather report, factual, neutral, carrying no particular investment in the outcome. Harlow looked back at Damon. "Where are you coming from, Atlanta? Visiting family in Decatur, heading back?" "What family?" "My family." Harlow's jaw shifted in the small, almost imperceptible way that jaws shift when a person doesn't get the specific elaboration they were angling for and doesn't want to show it. "What's the purpose of your travel today?" "Family visit," Damon said. "Returning home." Harlow held up the license and registration without appearing to read them. He had never glanced at them, not once, not even the cursory look a person gives a document when they're performing the act of checking it. He looked instead at the Range Rover, the trim, the rims, the factory paint that had cost what his cruiser was worth, and behind his eyes something moved that Naomi had seen before in other faces, on other roadsides, in other states, at other times of day. It was not quite hatred. It was something more ordinary and therefore more dangerous. It was the settled, unexamined certainty of a man who had decided without any evidence and without any particular effort of thought that certain kinds of people in certain kinds of cars meant a certain kind of problem, and that his job was to find the problem and document it. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Harlow said. Damon did not move immediately. "Officer," he said, with the same level patience he'd maintained throughout, "could you state your probable cause for this stop for the record?" Harlow's right hand moved to the top of the doorframe. His knuckles went pale. "I asked you to step out of the vehicle." "I heard you," Damon said. "I'm asking what you observed that justified the stop." Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 3.1 requires. "I don't need you quoting rules at me." Harlow's voice dropped into something quieter and more deliberate, and quieter in Naomi's experience was almost always worse than loud. "I observed a potential window tint violation. Now step out." Naomi watched Damon exchange a look with her, a look that had been developed over a lifetime of being siblings and sharpened over the years into something that could carry entire conversations in the space of a second. And then he opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder in one smooth motion, hands visible, nothing in them. Harlow pointed toward the rear of the vehicle. "Stand at the trunk." Damon walked to the trunk. Naomi opened her door and stepped out on the passenger side without being asked, because remaining inside the vehicle, while a confrontational officer managed her companion alone, was a configuration she had decided was worse. She stood with her bag on one shoulder, and both hands loose at her sides. Harlow looked at her sharply. "I didn't say you could exit." "You didn't say I couldn't," Naomi said with the same temperature she had used when she said good afternoon. "I prefer to stand." Harlow filed that away somewhere behind his eyes and did not respond to it directly. He went to the driver's side window and did not retrieve the tint meter clipped to his visor, the one that should have been the first thing he reached for if a tint violation was actually the reason for this stop, and instead walked a slow circle around the vehicle, running one hand along the passenger panel as he went, not checking anything, just making contact, establishing the simple fact that he could touch it if he wanted to. "Where are you employed?" He called back toward Damon, who was standing at the rear of the vehicle with his hands visible and his face neutral. "Private sector," Damon said. Harlow stopped. "Private sector covers a lot of ground." "It does." Naomi watched Harlow's eyes move to the slight rectangular outline visible through Damon's jacket fabric, the shape of a wallet or an ID holder, or something else, and hold there for just a half-second too long before moving on. He came around to the rear of the vehicle and stood beside Damon. "Open the cargo area." "Do you have consent to search?" Damon said. "Or a warrant?" Harlow turned to face him directly. He was slightly shorter than Damon, but he used the space between them differently forward in his weight-chin level, in the specific posture of a man who relied on physical proximity to communicate authority when words weren't producing the result he wanted. "I don't need your consent to conduct an inspection based on probable cause." "What's the probable cause for a cargo search?" Damon said. "You stopped us for a window tint." "The windows are the windows." Harlow stepped closer. "I'm detecting the odor of a controlled substance." Damon said nothing. From the passenger side, Naomi said quietly, "The windows have been down since before you approached." She kept her voice the same temperature it had been the entire time, the same temperature it would be until the day was over, and perhaps longer. "If you're detecting an odor, it's coming from an open window, which means it would need to have been strong enough to reach you from a distance." "Was it?" Harlow walked toward her. He closed the distance in 4 steps until he was standing close enough that she would have had to crane her neck slightly to maintain eye contact at a comfortable angle. He was the kind of man who understood that vertical proximity was its own form of pressure, and he had been using it as a tool for so long that it had become unconscious. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm conducting a lawful traffic stop. You are required to present identification." She reached into her bag slowly, 2 fingers only, and produced her Georgia driver's license. He took it. He looked at it. He looked at her. Naomi Voss. He turned the license over, looked at the back, looked at the front again with the focused attention of a man hoping to find something that would tell him what category to put her in. "What do you do?" "Documentation work," Naomi said. Harlow stopped. Something crossed his face, not recognition, not understanding, but the faint, unlocatable sense that a word had landed in a way he hadn't anticipated, the feeling you get when a door opens onto a room that's larger than the outside of the building suggested it could be. He held that feeling for exactly 1 second, and then, because he had spent 19 years on this road learning to trust his own certainty above everything else, he let it go. "Stay here," he said, and walked back to his cruiser. The first thing Naomi did when Harlow's back was turned was look at the body camera mounted on his left chest. It was a standard department issue unit, and she knew the model well enough to know exactly what the indicator light should have been doing, a solid blue glow, steady and clear, the way a camera looks when it's recording everything it's supposed to record. The indicator light was dark, not off in the way equipment goes off when it fails. Dark in the specific, deliberate way that a light goes dark when someone has made a choice about whether it should be on. She did not say anything. She noted the time on her watch, 14:09, and then she reached into her bag, the one Harlow had not asked to search, the one she had kept deliberately on her person, and withdrew a small navy notebook and a pen, uncapped it, and wrote 3 things in the margin of a page that already had writing on it. 14:09. BWC Unit Harlow Badge 1147 Indicator Dark. Stop initiated 1406, no documented infraction observed. Cargo search requested, no warrant consent withheld. Damon was watching her from the rear of the vehicle. His expression didn't change. He had seen her do this before. Not the same notebook and not the same road, but the same motion and the same calm, the same way of making the invisible visible by simply writing it down in a place where it would stay. He had asked her about it once years ago, and she had said that paper can't be erased by a power outage. He had not asked again. What Damon was thinking about standing at the rear of that Range Rover on the shoulder of Corridor 14 while his sister wrote in her notebook and Harlow sat in his cruiser running their plates was not the law. It was not probable cause or body camera indicators or the tint specifications on a vehicle he knew perfectly well fell within the legal range. What Damon was thinking about was the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from a single bad day, but from decades of accumulated ones. The exhaustion of a man who had learned on roads like this one in counties like this one. That the correct response to danger was stillness. That the correct response to provocation was patience. That the correct response to being treated as a problem was to make yourself as small and unthreatening and cooperative as possible and hope that it would be enough. He was a good architect. He had built beautiful things in this world. Structures that would stand for a century after he was gone, and he drove a car he had worked hard to afford and had never been anything other than what he appeared to be. And none of that had ever mattered on a road like this one. And he was 47 years old, and he was tired of knowing that. Not angry, not defeated. Just tired in the particular way you get tired when you realize the rules of a game were written before you were born and nobody asked you whether you wanted to play. Harlow returned from the cruiser. He was holding the license and registration, and he was also holding a handheld radio which he kept at his side. And Naomi could tell by the slight change in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around his jaw. The way his eyes had shifted from expectant to recalculating that the plates had come back clean, the names had come back clean, and he had not gotten what he wanted from dispatch, and now he was deciding what to do with that. "Mr. Voss," he said, standing in front of Damon at the rear of the vehicle. "I'm going to ask you one more time to open the cargo area. And I'm going to ask you one more time for the specific articulable facts supporting probable cause for a cargo search," Damon said. "That's my right under the Fourth Amendment." Harlow set his jaw in the way men set their jaws when they've decided that a conversation has gone on longer than they intended, and that the next step is action. His right hand came up fast, not a strike, not quite, but a grab, seizing Damon's left forearm just above the wrist and yanking it toward the cargo handle of the Range Rover. "Open the hatch." Damon's arm did not move. His feet did not move. He had the kind of physical presence that made grabbing him feel less like control and more like grabbing a wall. And he looked down at Harlow's hand on his arm and then back up at Harlow with the patience of a man who had decided a long time ago and in a very particular way exactly how he was going to handle a moment like this. "Officer," he said with the same voice he had been using since the beginning, "you are touching me without legal justification. I am not resisting. I am not threatening you. Remove your hand." Harlow held the grip for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt considerably longer to everyone present, and then released it. He stepped back. His jaw was working. From the passenger side, without looking up from her notebook, Naomi wrote 1417. Officer H, physical contact driver's left forearm, no resistance, no threat unprovoked. She capped the pen and looked up at the road ahead, at the flat stretch of it, at the heat shimmer making the asphalt look like it was breathing at the Finch Law billboard in the distance, catching the afternoon light at an angle that made it seem for just a moment like it was made of something much more fragile than it actually was. Sergeant Carol Beckett arrived in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, which told Naomi that she had been close, possibly already on the corridor, possibly in the habit of staying close when Harlow was working. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with dark hair cut short, and the kind of face that had been professionally neutral for so long it had forgotten what other configurations felt like. She parked behind Harlow's cruiser, walked to where he stood, conferred with him in a voice too low to carry, and then walked toward Damon and Naomi with a clipboard she had brought from her own vehicle. Mr. Voss. Miss Voss, she said, with the finishing school evenness of someone who had once been trained in de-escalation and had since decided it was a tool to be deployed selectively. I'm Sergeant Beckett. I've been asked to assist Officer Harlow with this stop. Please, Damon said. Officer Harlow has reasonable articulable suspicion consistent with Alabama rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 3.2 that this vehicle may contain contraband. That suspicion authorizes a brief detention for investigation. You are not under arrest. On what specific articulable facts is that suspicion based? Naomi asked. Beckett turned to her with the patient and slightly world-weary expression of someone who had answered a variant of this question many times and had a practiced response always ready. Ma'am, I understand you may have some familiarity with legal procedure, but you are not an attorney of record in this jurisdiction. I don't need to be an attorney of record, Naomi said, and reached into her bag and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper, not the notebook. A different document, crisp and printed and carrying a header she didn't display, and unfolded it to a specific paragraph. Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure, Rule 3.2, subsection. A lawful detention requires that the officer be able to articulate specific objective facts, not generalizations, not hunches, that combined with rational inferences from those facts reasonably warrant the belief that the person detained is engaged in criminal activity. She looked up. Specific objective facts. Officer Harlow has articulated two things window tint, which I addressed by citing the applicable code section and the factory specifications of this vehicle and an odor which has not been further specified. Those are the facts on record as of this moment. She paused. If there are additional facts, I'd like to hear them. Beckett's expression didn't change, but something behind it did a recalibration very small and very controlled. The adjustment of a person who had walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and found another. I'd also note Naomi said almost as an aside that Officer Harlow's body camera has been inactive since 1409. He initiated this stop at 1406. The stop is therefore not on record for those first 13 minutes. Body cameras malfunction, Beckett said. Yes, Naomi said, they do. What happened next was not loud, and it was not dramatic in the way that things are sometimes dramatic with shouting and struggle and the physical language of confrontation that people recognize from television and movies. What happened next was quiet and fast and felt in the moment. It was happening almost accidental, which was precisely the kind of thing that was hardest to explain afterward. Harlow, following some signal from Beckett that Naomi didn't see clearly enough to document, walked to the passenger side of the Range Rover, reached through the open window without asking, and picked up Naomi's bag from the passenger seat. Officer Naomi said, "That bag is not." Harlow pulled the bag out through the window, securing potential evidence. "You have no basis to search that bag," Naomi said, and she stepped forward, one deliberate step, and reached for the bag with both hands. Harlow pulled back. He yanked the bag away, and the strap still looped over his forearm swung outward, and the rigid corner of the bag caught Naomi across the left cheekbone. Not a strike, not intended as one not thrown with aim or malice, but it connected, and her head snapped sideways, and she stepped back one step and touched her face with two fingers. A white-hot silence descended on the shoulder of Corridor 14. Damon did not move. He held himself absolutely still with the kind of terrifying, deliberate stillness that takes everything a person has, every muscle, every instinct, every reflex, shaped by 47 years of knowing exactly what happens to black men who react on roadsides in Alabama. And he looked at Harlow with his hands visible and his face unreadable, and he made a choice in that moment that no one watching would ever fully understand the cost of. Naomi lowered her hand. There was a mark on her cheekbone, deep red, already beginning to swell at the edge. She looked at Harlow. She looked at the bag in his hands. And then, in a voice that had not changed temperature by a single degree, she said to no one in particular, "Write that down." The time is 14:24. Officer Harlow made physical contact with my face while seizing my personal property without consent warrant or probable cause. That is documented. Harlow's face had gone the color of old brick. He looked at the bag. He looked at her cheekbone. He looked at Beckett, and then he said both of them in the back seat. "We're going to the station." The Millhaven County Police Department was a flat-roofed building on the far end of Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store that had been half converted to storage and a vacant lot where something had once stood and nobody had bothered to remember what. The parking lot was hot asphalt and thin shade and 3 cruisers and a flagpole and a bulletin board behind glass near the entrance that held a cluster of notices, most of them too sun-faded to read through the afternoon glare. One of them was not faded. It was recent, printed on fresh white stock and laminated with care Millhaven Police Department Community Policing Initiative. This department is committed to constitutional bias-free policing. Citizens' rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments are respected and protected. Naomi read it once through the rear window of the cruiser as they pulled in. She did not read it again. The booking area was beige and fluorescent and smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee and the specific kind of institutional air that carries in it the weight of every conversation that has ever happened in a room like this one. A civilian desk clerk looked up when they were walked in, looked at Damon, and Naomi looked at Harlow and looked back down a small and practiced transaction, the kind that happens when something is too familiar to require much acknowledgement. Naomi noted the time on the clock above the door, 14:41. She noted 2 cameras visible in the booking area, one above the entry, one above the counter. She noted a 3rd camera in the hallway beyond the door marked processing, its housing positioned to cover the full corridor, its indicator light green. She noted all of this the way she noted everything. They were separated immediately. Damon taken in one direction, Naomi in another, into a small holding room with a metal table and 2 plastic chairs, and a smoke-yellowed mirror along the east wall. She had been told to wait. She was waiting. She had her notebook back because the officer who processed her had apparently decided it looked personal enough not to be a concern, which told her something about the assumptions people make about women with notebooks and which she filed alongside everything else. Officer Dana Pruitt appeared approximately 20 minutes into the wait, pushing the door open with her shoulder and carrying 2 paper cups of water, not bottled, just tap and setting both of them on the table, with the careful deliberateness of someone performing a small kindness in a place where small kindnesses required a specific kind of courage to offer. Her name tag said, Pruitt. She was young, mid-20s, with the look of someone still in the early years of deciding what kind of officer she was going to become. She looked at Naomi's cheekbone where the swelling had deepened and darkened since the road. She looked at the notebook. She opened her mouth. The door opened again behind her. Captain Leo Marsh walked in, a heavy-set white man in his mid-50s, with iron-gray hair and the measured authority of someone who had been managing difficult rooms for a long time and had developed a particular set of tools for it. "Pruitt," he said in the tone of one word that contained a complete instruction. Pruitt turned. Something moved across her face, a flicker of something that was not quite conflict and not quite submission, and she walked out of the room. The door closed behind her. Marsh sat down across from Naomi and placed both hands flat on the table and said in the reasonable and slightly tired voice of a man performing the role of reasonable authority, Ms. Voss, "I want to apologize for the friction during the stop." Officer Harlow is a practiced pause enthusiastic. He has 19 years of service, and sometimes that translates to an excess of caution. "An excess of caution," Naomi said. "In your case, yes. I want to make sure we can resolve this quickly and get you back on the road. I'd like to make a phone call." "Absolutely. Our system has been experiencing some connectivity issues this afternoon, but we're working on it. Probably another." He glanced at his watch, 30 minutes or so. Naomi wrote in her notebook 1441 phone call denied. Reason given connectivity issues. Captain Marsh present. Marsh watched her write. He asked what it was. She told him it was notes. He asked about what. She said everything. Marsh left, and 12 minutes later a different door opened and Warren Finch walked in. 60 years old, silver-haired, lean, in a suit that had been expensive when it was new, and still carried the suggestion of expense the way old money carries itself quietly and without needing to announce anything. He carried a soft leather briefcase. He set it on the table. He opened it with the relaxed efficiency of a man who had opened briefcases in rooms like this one many times before. He produced a manila folder. Inside it was a 2-page document with small text and a header that read, "Mutual release of claims and agreement not to sue." "This is a standard document," Finch said, turning it to face her. "Both parties release all claims arising from today's incident. In exchange, you and your brother are free to go immediately. No further processing. Your property is returned. No report is filed." Naomi looked at the document without touching it. "Read me Clause 4B, she said. Finch found it. He read. The releasing parties agreed to waive any and all claims, demands, damages, actions, or causes of action of any kind, civil, administrative, or otherwise arising out of or related to the events of today's date. Administrative claims, Naomi said. That includes internal affairs complaints. Is that your reading of administrative a pause that contained its own answer? That is one interpretation. It's the operative one. She looked at him across the table. Mr. Finch, if I sign this document, I waive my right to file a complaint with Internal Affairs about what occurred on Corridor 14 today, including the unauthorized search, including the physical contact, including the body camera gap. She placed her hands flat on the table, mirroring exactly the posture Marsh had used. I'm not signing it. Finch recrossed his legs and looked at her with an expression that had shifted, not to anger, not quite, but to something more considered and therefore more instructive about what he actually was. He mentioned Damon's licensed concealed firearm, tried the Alabama reciprocity angle. Naomi cited the exact code section. He tried the implied delay threat records, getting complicated schedules getting disrupted. She wrote it down while he was still speaking. At the door, he paused without turning. Ms. Voss, this county has a particular way of handling things. I've found that people who cooperate early tend to have much smoother experiences. The door closed. Naomi opened her notebook to a fresh page. 1522 Finch Warren Attorney. Mutual release presented. Clause 4, B waiver of administrative claims declined. Implied threat, re-records delay. Departure, 1531. She looked at the clock. She looked at the smooth yellowed mirror. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Reed Harlow had never thought of himself as a corrupt man. That was the important thing to understand about him. Not that it excused anything, but that it explained the machinery of how someone like him worked. How a person could spend 19 years on the same stretch of road, doing the same things to the same kinds of people, and feel at the end of every shift that he had done his job. He was not smart in the way that criminals are smart. He was not strategic in the way that strategists are strategic. What he was consistent, and in the institutional environment of the Millhaven County Police Department, consistency that produced numbers had always been its own justification. The Corridor 14 Enforcement Initiative had been running for 15 months before anyone thought to call it an initiative. Before that, it had just been Harlow working the stretch between mile markers 9 and 14, because it was as Captain Marsh had once said in a department briefing their best yield. Out-of-state plates. Nice cars. People who didn't know the local judge. People who, when things went sideways and they found themselves sitting in a holding room at the end of a long afternoon, were far more likely to accept a quiet settlement and go home than to stay and fight something in a county where they didn't live and didn't vote and didn't know anyone. Harlow had stopped 94 vehicles on that stretch in the last 18 months. He had found no contraband. He had filed no successful charges. But 12 of those stops had produced settlements, and the settlements had produced consulting payments to an LLC registered in his wife's name, and those payments had arrived so regularly and at such predictable intervals, always 6 weeks after the settlement closed, always through Warren Finch's firm, that Harlow had stopped thinking about where they came from. It had just become part of the rhythm of the job. You do the stops, Finch does the rest, the checks come. He genuinely believed that the people he stopped were the kinds of people who ought to be stopped. This was not a performance. He had spent enough years in this county, in this uniform, on this road, to have constructed a complete and internally consistent worldview in which expensive, out-of-state vehicles driven by black people through rural Alabama were themselves a form of probable cause, a category of risk, a problem waiting to be documented. The worldview had never been seriously challenged, because the people who challenged it had always, until today, eventually signed the paper and gone home. The woman with the notebook had not signed the paper. That was what kept coming back to him as he sat in the equipment room cataloging breathalyzer calibration records, surrounded by orange traffic cones and the low hum of an industrial HVAC system. She had sat in that holding room with a mark on her cheekbone and her notebook in her hand, and looked at Finch across that table and said, "I'm not signing it with the flat certainty of someone who had known before she walked into the room exactly what the room would contain." He thought about the moment she had said documentation work. There had been something in those two words, some weight in the way she had delivered them, some quality of completeness, as though she were answering a question he hadn't realized he was asking, and he had felt it for a second before he'd decided not to think about it. He was deciding not to think about it again. He cataloged another breathalyzer and told himself it would work itself out the way things always worked themselves out, the way they had worked themselves out for 19 years on the same road. In the room on the other side of the building, Damon had been sitting for 2 hours and 15 minutes when Harlow came in alone, without Beckett, without Marsh, without any paperwork in his hands. Just a man with a working jaw and 19 years of a particular kind of certainty walking in to say the thing he apparently needed to say. "You think you're smart," Harlow said, standing by the table. "Coming through here with your out-of-state plates and your lawyer talk. You think you're the first Damon watched the clock on the wall. Not because he was nervous, because it was the only way he knew to stay anchored to something that wasn't what was happening in this room." Harlow stepped closer. He said the thing about knowing Damon's type, the nice car, the nice suit, the acting like they know everything. He said he'd been on this road 19 years. He said something about what all of them had in common, and then he slammed his palm down on the table flat and hard, and the sound of it rang off the walls like a shot. "I'd like a witness present," Damon said. "You'd like a what?" "I'd like a witness present for this conversation. I'm requesting that formally." Harlow grabbed Damon's collar, both hands the same grip he had used on the road, twisting the fabric, and hauled him half out of the chair, and got close enough to breathe on him, and said in a voice wound tight as a spring, "You're going to sit here until I decide what to do with you. And you're going to stop talking." The door opened. Officer Dana Pruitt stood in the doorway with a processing form in her hand, and a face going through 3 distinct configurations in about 1 second, what she had expected to find, what she was actually finding, and the decision about what to do with the difference between those two things. Harlow released Damon and stepped back and straightened his shirt and said, Pruitt later in a controlled voice, and Pruitt held up the form and said, "The desk needed a signature," and Harlow said later again, and Pruitt looked at Damon. Damon's collar was twisted. His jaw was set. He was looking directly at Pruitt, not at Harlow at Pruitt, and holding her gaze with the quiet and intentional steadiness of a man who has run out of other options and is making one last bet on the possibility that someone in the room will choose to be the person they ought to be. Pruitt looked at Harlow. She looked at the form. She walked out of the room. The door did not close all the way. The latch did not catch, and there was a gap perhaps an inch along the frame, and in the hallway beyond that gap the corridor B camera maintained its steady green indicator light. Damon sat back down. He looked at the gap in the door. He looked at the green light visible through it. And he thought for the first time since the afternoon began, not about himself but about Naomi, about the Navy notebook, and the 2-finger reach into the bag, and the way she had read that sign at 53 miles per hour and not needed to read it again. He thought she knew this road before we drove it. She knew this room before we were put in it. And something in his chest, some particular knot of exhaustion and fear that had been there since the lights came on behind them, loosened by a fraction of a degree, because if Naomi had known, then today was not an ending. It was something else entirely. Naomi and Damon were released at 17:22. No charges, no filing. Her bag was returned with a printed inventory receipt listing every item inside it, which told her they had opened it and gone through it completely at some point during the afternoon. And the notebook was not on the list because it had been on her person the entire time, and she was glad for that, in the particular way you are glad for things you planned in advance. They walked out of the station into the late afternoon Alabama light, and it had changed since they came in, less flat now, more golden, carrying that specific quality of the southern end-of-day sun that makes everything look briefly historical, like a photograph taken just before something changes permanently. Damon unlocked the Range Rover in the far corner of the lot where it had been moved from the road. They got in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Damon said, without starting the car, "They went through everything in the bag, fully inventoried, and they're wondering who you are." "They're wondering," Naomi said. "They don't know yet." She folded the receipt carefully and put it in her notebook. Damon put the key in the ignition. He did not start the car. He looked at the steering wheel for a moment, and then he said in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, the voice of someone saying something that has been sitting in his chest since a particular moment on a particular afternoon when he had my collar, both times. I kept thinking, don't move, don't give them anything, don't move. That's a particular kind of tired Naomi. Naomi was quiet. "I know that kind," she said. "I know it exactly." It was the most either of them had said about what the day had cost them. It would have to be enough for now. Naomi put her hand on the dashboard, a small gesture stopping him before he started the engine, and she was looking at the bulletin board near the station entrance, the one she had read through the window on the way in. At the bottom of the community policing notice, half hidden by the edge of the board mounting, was a smaller card recent printed on department letterhead. Corridor 14 Traffic Enforcement Initiative, Month 18, Results Attached. Deputy Chief H.F. Naomi took out her phone and photographed the board through the windshield. H.F. Damon said. "Who's H.F.?" She looked at the Finch Law billboard on the corner of Main Street, catching the last of the afternoon light. The H and the F very large on the signage. The silver-haired attorney in his three-quarter pose promising results, always promising results. "I have a guess," she said. "But guesses don't hold in a hearing." She put the phone in her bag. "Drive. We need to file before tomorrow morning." Damon pulled out of the lot and onto Main Street, and the station got smaller in the mirror, and the billboard got larger as they approached it, and then fell away behind them as they moved through the last light of the afternoon, out of Millhaven, back onto the federal corridor. The same road, the same asphalt, the same mile markers, counting backward from 14. At mile marker 9, exactly where the enforcement zone ended, Naomi looked back over her shoulder. Nothing behind them. She reached into her bag and found beneath the first notebook a second one, smaller, older, with a cover that had been reinforced at the corners with black electrical tape, the corners worn smooth from handling. She did not open it. She held it in her lap for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then put it back. The road opened up ahead, wide and straight, heading north, and Naomi Voss looked at it the way she looked at everything, complete, thorough, without needing to look again. Naomi filed the internal affairs complaint at 6:47 the following morning from the parking lot of a gas station 12 miles north of Millhaven, sitting in the passenger seat with her laptop open on her knees and a coffee going cold in the cup holder. The complaint form was a standard I, a document available on the department's public-facing website, which was itself a small irony she noted without dwelling on. She filled it out in 11 minutes. Complainant Naomi Voss. Officers involved Deputy Reed Harlow, Badge 1147, Sergeant Carol Beckett, Captain Leo Marsh. Nature of complaint: unlawful vehicle stop without documented probable cause, unauthorized seizure of personal property, physical contact resulting in injury during property seizure, denial of telephone access for approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes detention without charge for 3 hours and 41 minutes. She attached nothing. She submitted it and received an automated acknowledgement within 4 minutes. Your complaint has been received and assigned case number IA-2024-0391. An investigator will contact you within 30 business days. 30 business days, 6 weeks. Damon handed her the coffee. She drank it without saying anything about the temperature. Then she reached into her bag and withdrew the second notebook, the small one with the reinforced corners and the worn cover, and opened it to the first page for the first time since the car ride back. The first page read in her own handwriting. Case file pre-existing. Do not open in field. Below that, a case number. Below that, a date 8 months ago. Below that, Millhaven County Corridor 14 pattern or practice suspected authorization pending confirmation. She turned to the next line, the one she had written that morning before the sun was fully up, and read it back to herself. Authorization confirmed. Day 1. Damon was looking at the notebook. He was not looking at the words. Exactly, the page was angled away from him, but he was looking at the fact of it at the age of the tape on the corners and the weight of what it implied. And she watched him arrive at understanding the way you watch a landscape reveal itself when fog clears gradually, and then all at once. This had never been a family visit. It had always been this. She had chosen him as her companion, not because it was convenient, but because she had needed someone who would be exactly what he was. Steady, cooperative, credible, believable, and because he was her brother, and she had believed she could protect him, and she had believed wrong because no amount of preparation had made Harlow's hand leave Damon's collar any faster. You were doing this the whole time, Damon said. Not an accusation, a statement, an adjustment. I was doing both, Naomi said. You were never bait. You were never in danger. I didn't calculate. But I should have. Don't, he said. He was looking at the road ahead, at the flat white sky of a southern summer morning. Don't apologize for the investigation. Apologize for not telling me. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. Okay, he said, and that was all. She made a phone call, brief and precise, confirming the stop. Confirming 18 months of documented basis, confirming the formal report would be filed in 72 hours. She said she now had standing as a direct victim. She said they were fine. She hung up and put the phone away, and they drove north in the particular silence of two people who have known each other long enough to know which silences require words and which ones don't. 3 weeks after the stop, Damon drove back to Millhaven alone. He didn't go to the station. He went to the diner on Main Street, the one whose sign had been dark when they passed through, but which turned out to be open on weekday mornings and to serve coffee that was considerably better than the exterior suggested it would be. He sat at the counter, and the woman behind it, Bernadette Cole, set a mug in front of him without being asked, because she was 68 years old and had been reading people at that counter for 4 decades, and could tell when a man needed something hot to hold on to. He didn't ask about the police directly. He asked about the billboard. Bernadette's expression when he mentioned it was the expression of someone who has bitten down on something sour so many times that the bitterness no longer reaches their face, just settles somewhere deeper in the chest, in the way a person exhales. Finch, she said. The word contained a complete sentence. Local attorney. Set up shop right around when they started doing those corridor stops? Funny timing. She refilled his mug without his asking. You know how many people I've seen come in here after getting pulled over on that stretch, out-of-towners mostly. Nice cars, nice clothes. Come in shaking some of them. Been in that station half the day, and then a week later they get a card in the mail from Finch saying he can help them file a claim. Damon set down his coffee. He solicits the complainants. He's got a runner, she said. Young guy. Shows up at the station, sometimes hands out cards to people waiting in the lot. Before they even get home, the call comes. She wiped the counter. County settles every single one of them, quietly. and the officer who did the stop gets a consulting payment from Finch's firm 6 weeks later. She set the cloth down. Everybody knows. Nobody does anything. She said the last sentence with the exhausted flatness of someone reporting a fact that has been known for so long that the outrage ran out years ago, and what's left is just the fact sitting there waiting for someone to finally pick it up. Damon thanked her. He left $20 for a $4 coffee. He called Naomi from the parking lot. "Write it down," she said. "Already did. Bernadette, full name if she'll give it." "She'll give it?" Damon said. "She's been waiting for someone to ask." The FOIA documents arrived on day 37 partially. Naomi spread them across the kitchen table in her Atlanta apartment and worked through all 847 pages over the course of 6 hours, reading with the methodical attention of someone who was not looking for a single incriminating sentence, but for the shape of a pattern, the way certain facts clustered, the way certain gaps repeated, the way the negative spaces in a document sometimes told a clearer story than the words. What she found organized carefully and cross-referenced in the margins was this. Harlow had stopped 94 vehicles on Corridor 14 in the past 18 months. 61 of those stops involved out-of-state plates. 47 of the 61 involved black drivers or passengers as the primary contact. No contraband had been found in any of the 94 stops. No charges had been filed in any of them. But 12 settlements had been reached, totaling the financial figures were redacted every single dollar amount blacked out, and body camera activation logs showed gaps in 23 of the 94 stops with equipment malfunction listed as the reason 17 times. She thought reading through the numbers not about the numbers themselves, but about the people inside them. 47 stops. 47 moments on a shoulder like the shoulder at mile marker 12. 47 conversations with hands visible and voices level, and the particular bone-deep exhaustion of having to be exactly right when the other person was allowed to be exactly wrong. She thought about Damon's hands on the steering wheel. She thought about the way he had said, "Don't move," like it was a prayer he'd been saying for years. The email was on page 612. Partially redacted, but enough visible from H. Finch to L. Marsh, subject line. Corridor 14. Monthly numbers date 6 weeks before the stop. Body text that read in the portions not blacked out. "Delia, remind the boys the stretch between mile markers 9 and 14 is our best yield. Out-of-state plates, nice cars. They don't know the local judge. The last 3 settled at the rate we discussed. RC gets his payment Friday. Keep the camera logs clean. The gap pattern from last fall almost caused a problem. Tell him to vary the reasons. HP." Below that, a forwarding notation. Marsh had sent this email to a third address, completely redacted, with a note that read, "FYI." She might want to know about this in case it becomes a thing. Naomi circled the word she in red. She sat for a long moment looking at it. Then she turned to page 613 and kept reading. The IA investigator was a man named Leonard Oates, who sounded over the phone like someone who had been doing a difficult job long enough to have developed a careful and slightly armored relationship with Surprise. He asked her to describe the incident. She did precisely and without editorializing, and he asked follow-up questions that were procedurally thorough, if not particularly energetic. And when she told him she had documentation, he asked how much. She told him she would send it within 24 hours. She sent it within 6. 412 pages. Contemporaneous notes. Photographs of her cheekbone at 4 different time intervals over the 48 hours following the incident. A photograph of the mutual release document taken at an angle with her phone camera. Before Finch put it away, the body camera log cross-referenced against the maintenance record showing the unit returned in normal working condition and the email from page 612. Oates called back 2 days later. His voice had a different quality. "Ms. Voss, I want to be transparent. The scope of what you've submitted goes beyond the individual stop. If what you're describing is accurate, it's documented. If the documentation supports the scope, he continued carefully, this would likely move beyond a standard a complaint. A pause. Are you planning to remain available over the next several weeks? I am, she said. And she was. A week later, attorney Clara Webb called from Birmingham's civil rights cases against municipal law enforcement, 17 years of it, the particular methodical precision of someone who had learned that drama worked against you in administrative proceedings and had adjusted every instinct accordingly. She had read the heuristic complaint and the 412 pages and called specifically to say with the professional directness of someone who did not waste language. You filed this yourself without representation, and the documentation is the most thorough I've seen on an initial complaint in 17 years. What do you do? Documentation work, Naomi said. For the second time in this story, she said those two words. And for the second time, the person across from her stopped and weighed them and found them heavier than they looked. Webb looked at the 412 pages on the desk in front of her and said, What kind of documentation? And Naomi did not answer, and Webb, who was smart enough to know which questions to stop asking, said, Are you prepared for a hearing? And Naomi said, I've been prepared since day one. In the second notebook that night, Naomi wrote one additional line below the case number and the date and the confirmation. Find she, third address, H. Finch. Harlow had been reassigned to the equipment room, which was the department's way of moving a problem sideways without technically moving it anywhere, and he had developed the habit. Small rebellion, small daily escape from the fluorescent humiliation of counting traffic cones, of eating his lunch in the parking lot of a gas station 3 blocks from the station, sitting in his personal vehicle with the windows down and his radio off, and the specific quiet of a man trying not to think about the thing he is thinking about. Day 58, a young woman got out of the car that had parked next to his and introduced herself as Tessa Roy from the Millhaven Courier. She was 26 and had been covering the county for 2 years and had the particular advantage of being consistently underestimated, which she had learned to treat as a professional asset. She asked about the stop. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. It had been recording since before she got out of her car. Harlow talked. He talked in the way that men talk when they have been confined to an equipment room for nearly 2 months. And believe incorrectly that a gas station parking lot is a space without consequences. That distance from the building means distance from accountability. He said that those people had no reason to be on that road. He said out of state means out of jurisdiction, which means they don't know how things work here. He said his body camera malfunctions all the time, and he had been saying so for 2 years. He said Finch just does what Finch does, and he didn't have anything to do with that. Tessa Roy wrote it all down. The piece ran 6 days later. 400 words in print, longer online, precisely sourced and carefully worded in the way that local reporters write when they know the story is larger than their platform and are trying to construct something sturdy enough to survive being picked up by someone with a bigger one. A P ran it in 48 hours, 4 regional papers in 72, 2 national wire services in 96, and in Naomi's notebook, a text from a number she didn't save in her contacts. AG office contacted I. A Millhaven Monday morning. You have people in the right places. She wrote in the notebook, day 64, AG contacted IA, unknown source, third address. She cross-referenced. She knew who it was. She was not ready to write it down yet. The Internal Affairs disciplinary hearing was held in a building in Montgomery Neutral Ground, insisted upon by Webb, who had spent 17 years learning which battles to fight before the main one started. The hearing panel was 3 people: the independent hearing officer, a retired judge named Harmon, who had the settled and slightly wary patience of someone who had seen most of what people do to each other under the pressure of institutional power, a representative from County HR, and a representative from the Police Officers Association, which meant that one of the 3 had an institutional interest in the outcome that was not aligned with Naomi's. She had accounted for this. Across the table, Harlow in a suit that didn't fit him the way his uniform did his silver blonde hair under the overhead lights looking almost white. Beside him, his union attorney Finster, who had the confident and slightly bored demeanor of someone with a settled win rate in rooms exactly like this one. Beckett in uniform. Marsh in uniform, sitting slightly apart from the others in a way that was trying to communicate a distinction she hoped someone would notice. Finster's opening statement used the phrase professional judgment 4 times in 11 minutes. Webb's opening was 2 minutes long and contained no dramatics whatsoever, just a list of what the documentation would show stated plainly, without emphasis, in the voice of someone who understood that the documents didn't need her help. The evidence presentation took most of the morning. Webb submitted each item with a brief authentication note, the body camera activation log, the maintenance record showing no defect, found the incident report with no tint measurement taken and no measurement instrument deployed. The 47-stop demographic data read aloud as numbers without commentary, and then the email from page 612, which she read in full into the record. The room was very quiet when she finished. Harmon wrote something on the legal pad in front of him. He had been writing more than a person writes when they've already decided the outcome. Then came the maintenance log cross-reference, which was the piece of evidence that in Naomi's assessment landed the hardest, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most unambiguous. Harlow had submitted his body camera for maintenance 11 times in 3 years. In 10 of those 11 submissions, the unit had been returned with a notation of no defect found, and in 9 of those 10 instances, the submission had followed a stop in which the activation log showed a gap. Not once, not twice, 9 times. Finster objected to the relevance of the prior submissions. Harmon considered it for 4 seconds. "I'll allow it," he said. "Pattern evidence is germane." And he wrote something else, and the union representative, who had been quiet for most of the morning, chose that moment to note that Harlow had served 19 years with no formal disciplinary record. And Webb said, without looking up from her notes, "The absence of a formal record and the absence of misconduct are not the same thing as the maintenance log demonstrates," and the room went quiet again, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true has just been said in a way that doesn't leave much room for argument. Dana Pruitt testified at 11:42. She came in uniform. She sat at the witness table and folded her hands in front of her and looked at hearing officer Harmon with the careful, measured steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this not to perform it but to make sure she said the truth in the exact order and with the exact words it needed. Webb asked her what she had observed when she entered the processing room on the afternoon in question. Pruitt said that Officer Harlow had Mr. Voss by the collar and had pulled him partially out of the chair, and that Mr. Voss was not resisting and had been seated. Webb asked what Harlow did when Pruitt entered. Pruitt said he released Mr. Voss and stepped back. Webb asked her to characterize what she had seen. Pruitt was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing words not for effect but for precision. It was not consistent with standard detainee management procedure, she said. Mr. Voss was not resisting. He was seated. Webb asked what Pruitt had done after that. She said she delivered the form she had been sent to deliver and left. Webb asked whether she had closed the door behind her. A brief pause. "Not completely," Pruitt said. "Why not?" Pruitt looked at her hands. Then she looked at Harmon. "Because I thought it was important that what was happening in that room be visible." To the camera in Corridor B, yes. Finster objected speculation about the witness's intent. Harmon said she was testifying to her own intent and overruled it without looking up. Officer Pruitt Webb said the camera in Corridor B was operational at the time. "Yes. How do you know?" "Because I checked the indicator before I walked past it," Pruitt said. "I made a point of checking it." A silence settled over the room, not an uncomfortable silence, but a heavy one, the kind that follows something that has been said clearly and cannot be unsaid. I wanted to make sure someone was recording. Finster began another objection. Harmon held up a hand without looking at him. "Continue," he said. In the corridor during the lunch break, Webb handed Naomi a bottle of water and said without preamble, "Harmon is writing more than he needs to write if he's going to find insufficient evidence." Naomi said she knew. Webb looked at her the careful, calibrated look of someone trying to understand what kind of client they actually had. "You've been very measured throughout all of this," she said. "Most people, even people with strong cases, show something. Anger, nerves, satisfaction when something lands." A pause. "You just note it. Showing it doesn't help the record," Naomi said. "No," Webb said. "It doesn't." Another pause. "Someone tipped you that the AG contacted IA. Someone inside this process is aligned with your outcome." She said it clinically without implication. "I'm not asking for a name. I'm asking so I know what I can rely on." Naomi considered the question. "Someone who knew what Corridor 14 was before I got stopped on it," she said. "Someone who was waiting for a complainant who could follow through." Webb absorbed this. She did not ask the next question. She was smart enough to know exactly where to stop. "Afternoon session starts at 2, she said. "Marsh testifies." Delia Marsh testified for 40 minutes and managed with considerable skill to say almost nothing. Not through stonewalling, not the clumsy, obvious kind of evasion that produces its own kind of evidence, but through precision, through the careful use of hedged language, through the deployment of, to my knowledge, at strategic intervals, like a particular kind of professional armor. Naomi tracked it in the margin of her notes. By the time it was over, the count was 14. When Webb asked about the email, Marsh said she had received a communication from Mr. Finch referencing corridor enforcement priorities and had understood it as a reference to legitimate enforcement objectives. When Webb pressed on, "They don't know the local Judge Marsh said she had understood the communication in its overall context." When Webb asked about keep the camera logs clean, Marsh said she had understood it as a general reference to operational compliance. "Camera logs are not equipment maintenance records," Webb said. "I understood it as a general reference," Marsh said in the same tone she had been using for 15 answers. When Webb turned to the forwarding notation on page 613, the record of Marsh having forwarded the email to a third still redacted address, Marsh said she would need to review her records. When Webb asked whether she knew who the third address belonged to, Marsh said she would need to review her records. When Webb asked whether she knew why the address had been redacted in the FOIA response, Finster objected on grounds of custodianship. Harmon sustained it and asked Webb to rephrase, and Webb said simply, "Do you know who the third address belongs to?" Marsh said she would need to review her records. Webb let the answer sit for 3 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly what was happening in those 3 seconds, and then said nothing further and sat down. In the corridor afterward, Naomi caught Harlow's gaze across the hall before he looked away. He was looking at her the way people look at something they have been wrong about for a very long time, and are only now beginning to understand the shape of their wrongness, though they do not yet have the words for it. She did not hold the look to press it. She just noted it the way she noted everything else and let it go. Ada Calvin Oates, from the Northern District of Alabama, called Webb 12 days after the hearing. His voice, when Webb relayed the substance of the call, had the quality she had learned to recognize, not surprise, because Oates had been a federal prosecutor long enough not to be surprised by most things, but a particular kind of heightened attention, the voice of a man who has been handed something heavier than he expected to carry that day. The Alabama AG's office had reviewed the FOIA appeal materials as part of their assessment and had referred the matter to Oates's office under 18 U.S.C., Section 242, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and potentially Section 241 conspiracy, because the financial nexus between Harlow's enforcement activity and Finch's settlement scheme did not look, when you laid it out in a timeline and added the email and the consulting payments routed through an LLC in Harlow's wife's name, like coincidence or even convenience. It looked like design. There was a cooperating witness, Oates said. He wouldn't name them. But this witness had direct knowledge of the financial arrangement, not circumstantial, not inferred from documents, but direct knowledge from inside the operation. Immunity terms were being finalized. When Naomi asked about Warren Finch, Oates was careful in the specific way that federal prosecutors are careful when they are in the process of building something they cannot yet name out loud. He said they were examining all parties whose conduct was reflected in the available documentation. Naomi said, the third address. Marsh forwarded that email to someone who was described as needing to know in case it becomes a thing. That person has not been identified. That person, I believe, is Harold Finch. Former deputy chief of this department, retired 14 months before I filed my complaint, and the person who managed the settlement approval process from the department side. She paused. He's not peripheral. He's the approval chain. Oates wrote something down. She could hear the pen on paper through the phone. He wrote slowly. He said, "We'll be in contact, Ms. Voss." And she wrote in her notebook, Day 71. Oates Calvin, ADA Northern District. Criminal Inquiry Open. Sections 241 and 242. Cooperating Witness. Harold Finch not yet formally under investigation. Audit still needed. It was not planned. That was the first thing to understand about the moment, that nobody had arranged for it, that no one had orchestrated it. That it happened the way the most consequential things tend to happen, through the simple and indifferent mechanics of two people being in the same hallway at the same time. Naomi was at the Federal Building in Birmingham on a Wednesday morning for a meeting with Oates about the criminal inquiry. A preliminary conversation. Nothing yet on the record. Just the beginning of the process of aligning the administrative findings with the federal investigation and understanding which parts of the documentation would serve which purpose. She arrived early and sat in the corridor outside Oates's office with her notebook open, not reading it, just holding it the way you hold something familiar when you are in an unfamiliar place. Harlow was there because he'd been required to appear a procedural administrative notice mandatory compliance for officers under suspension facing department review. The kind of bureaucratic summons that his union attorney had described as routine of formality. Nothing to worry about. He arrived with the union attorney at his side and the specific expression of a man who has been telling himself for a considerable number of weeks that the whole thing is going to be manageable and that he just needs to get through each individual step and not do anything that makes it worse. He came around the corner of the corridor and saw Naomi sitting outside Oates's office. He recognized her immediately, the navy notebook, the stillness, the cheekbone that had healed by now, but that he saw anyway in the way you see things that have been pressed into your memory against your will. He recognized her the way you recognize someone you have been wrong about, which is to say, with something that sits lower than the stomach and stays longer than most feelings. The door to Oates's office opened. A senior FBI supervisor stepped out into the hallway, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who carried institutional authority the way some people carry a coat so naturally and for so long that it had become simply the way he moved. He saw Naomi and walked toward her and extended his hand, and when she shook it, he said in the easy and unhurried voice of a colleague greeting a colleague in a hallway, "Good to see you, Special Agent Voss. We're ready when you are." The title hit the hallway the way a single clean note hits a room when every other sound has stopped. Special Agent Voss. Harlow's feet stopped moving. Not slowed. Stopped mid-stride with his right foot lifted and his body suspended between one step and the next in the particular physical grammar of someone whose brain has just received information that the rest of the body hasn't caught up to yet. His union attorney stopped a fraction of a second later. They both stood there, and the only sounds in the hallway were the distant hum of the building's HVAC system and the quiet click of a door opening further down the corridor. Naomi stood. She gathered her notebook. She did not look at Harlow. Not because she was avoiding him, not out of anger, not out of deliberate withholding, but because she had been on her way to the meeting before he arrived, and she was still on her way to the meeting. She had somewhere to be. She had always had somewhere to be. She walked toward the open door, and she was almost through it when she paused. Not dramatically, not for effect. Just a natural, brief pause. The pause of someone who has thought of something and looked back. Harlow was still standing in the hallway with his foot down now, and his hands uncertain at his sides, and his face moving through the stages of a long, slow reckoning that he had not known was coming until it arrived. The silver blonde hair under the fluorescent lights, the wide shoulders and the loaded belt, and the 19 years of certainty. And now the particular expression of a man who has just understood something that cannot be unknown, that the woman he had pulled over on a shoulder in Alabama, the woman he had grabbed a bag from, the woman he had watched go to the station in his back seat, had not been what he had decided she was, had never been, and that every assumption he had made from the moment he saw that Range Rover in his mirror, every decision, every grab, every word spoken in a room he thought was his had been made about a federal agent, about someone who had been building a case against the road he worked, the system he served, the structure he had spent 19 years inside of for 8 months before he ever pulled up behind her. The union attorney leaned close and said in a low and urgent voice, "Reed, we need to talk, right now." Harlow didn't move for another second. He was looking at the door that had closed behind Naomi. Just a door, an ordinary door with a plain metal handle. Nothing remarkable about it except that on the other side of it was a conversation he would never be part of, and a case file that bore his name, and a world that had been operating quietly and precisely, and without his knowledge in the spaces between everything he thought he controlled. Reed, he turned. He walked back the way he had come, and for the first time in 19 years, on the same road, in the same county, in the same uniform, Reed Harlow did not know what happened next. The IA findings came on a Thursday morning, exactly 15 business days after the hearing. Webb emailed them with a note that said, "Read pages 1 through 4, then call me." Naomi read all 18 pages first. The findings were not a shock. She had built them. But reading the words in the official document, seeing them assembled in the language of institutional authority, stamped with a case number and a date, carried a weight that was separate from the weight of having known they were coming. The way. Hearing your own name read aloud in a room is different from knowing what your name is. As to Officer Reed Harlow, suspended without pay, pending further review matter, referred to the district attorney's office. The pattern of body camera gaps cross-referenced with maintenance records showing no equipment defect raises a significant credibility concern regarding the equipment malfunction explanation. The physical contact during property seizure was not consistent with departmental use of force policy for a cooperative, non-threatening subject. As to Sergeant Carol Beckett, written reprimand, mandatory retraining in constitutional stop procedures. As to Captain Leo Marsh, placed on administrative leave with pay pending completion of the ongoing criminal inquiry. The panel noted that the financial nexus documented between departmental enforcement activity and private legal representation constitutes a serious concern that exceeds the scope of this administrative hearing. Additional findings. The panel recommended an independent audit of Corridor 14 enforcement activities covering the preceding 24 months, commissioned by the City Council to be completed by an entity with no prior relationship with the department or Mr. Finch's firm. All future stops on the corridor, subject to mandatory body camera activation. Violation to result in automatic disciplinary review. Naomi called Webb. "The Marsh determination is qualified," she said, "pending the criminal inquiry, which could take a year, and Finch isn't in the findings at all. He's civilian. The criminal referral is the only avenue." A pause. "Naomi, this is a strong outcome for an administrative proceeding. Suspension, written reprimand, administrative leave, independent audit, mandatory body camera policy. Most IA complaints are closed with nothing." Naomi knew this. She had known it before she filed. The third address is still unknown. The financial figures in the settlements are still redacted. The FOIA appeal is still pending. She looked out the window of her apartment at the Atlanta skyline doing its afternoon thing. And nobody has explained what happened in those first 13 minutes. The IA findings note the credibility concern, Webb said. "They don't resolve the 13 minutes. "No," Naomi said. "They don't." The Alabama AG's office ruled on the FOIA appeal 6 months after the stop. The ruling the department's application of the law enforcement investigation exemption had been improperly broad. The redacted financial records from the settlement register were ordered disclosed within 30 days. The redacted third email address was ordered disclosed within 30 days, subject to legitimate privacy protections for private individuals not currently under investigation. The financial records arrived on a Tuesday. Naomi spread them across the kitchen table. 12 settlements in 18 months. Total value $462,000 paid from the county's general liability fund, taxpayer money, every dollar of it paid to make the complaints disappear before anyone had to answer for them. Finch's firm had received 30% of each settlement as legal fees totaling $138,600. Of that, $41,000 had been paid in consulting fees to an LLC registered in Harlow's wife's name, always 6 weeks after the settlement closed, always through Finch's accounts, always just deniable enough to require one more piece of evidence to become undeniable. The cooperating witness had apparently provided that piece. The third email address, when it was disclosed, belonged to Harold Finch, not Warren Finch, the attorney, but Harold Finch, former deputy chief of the Millhaven County Police Department, retired 14 months before Naomi filed her complaint. One letter different. Two men with the same last name and interlocking roles in the same operation. Warren on the outside building the pipeline, Harold on the inside, approving every settlement, managing the financial flow from the department's side, ensuring that the institutional machinery ran quietly and without friction. Harold had retired to a house in Gulf Shores with a pension, and according to records Naomi requested through a separate channel, had been the department's liaison to the county's general liability insurer. The person who had signed off on every one of the 12 settlements. The person Marsh had forwarded the email to. The person who had been told in case it becomes a thing to know about it. It had become a thing. Naomi wrote his name in full in her notebook, former title date of retirement date of the email, and emailed. Dr. Renata Webb, the independent auditor appointed by the City Council. A single-line audit scope should include settlement approval. Chain deputy chief level and above. In Gulf Shores, on the back porch of a comfortable house with a view of the Gulf of Mexico as a flat blue line at the horizon. Harold Finch had developed over the past 3 months. A new habit he had not had before, checking the mail each morning with the particular careful attention of a man who has begun to understand that the shape of the world around him is in the process of changing, and that when it finishes changing, it will be pointing at him. The mail had not yet contained anything unusual, not yet. The Millhaven City Council met on a Wednesday evening in a chamber that held 80 people and had approximately 120 in it when Naomi and Damon walked in. Tessa Roy from the Courier was there, and 2 reporters from Birmingham papers and a local TV crew set up in the back, and in the third row dressed in the good clothes she reserved for the occasions when Millhaven County needed to know she was paying attention. Sat Bernadette Cole alongside 3 other women whose names Naomi didn't know, but whose presence she recognized immediately. Women who had been watching this county for decades, and had been waiting with the deep and patient waiting of people who have learned that justice moves slowly, but does sometimes move for a moment exactly like this one. Councilman Ted Wiley called the session to order. He moved through the early agenda items with the practiced efficiency of someone trying to reach the difficult thing at a speed that felt controlled. When he introduced the IA findings, and said, "I want to note for the record that this department has 20 years of service to this community and the actions of one officer," a woman in the second row said clearly and without raising her voice. 3 officers. The chamber went quiet. Wiley found her. He recognized her. She had been coming to council meetings for 30 years and had been saying the thing that needed to be said in exactly the tone it needed to be said for all of them. Naomi stood for public comment. She did not use notes. She had written what she needed to say 3 days ago and had not looked at it since. She looked at each council member in turn as she spoke, not as a rhetorical gesture, not for effect, but because she wanted to be certain they heard her as a person speaking to people, not as a complainant addressing a process. "My name is Naomi Voss," she said. "I was stopped on Corridor 14 without probable cause. I had personal property seized without warrant or consent. I sustained physical injury during that seizure. I was denied a phone call for 1 hour and 40 minutes. I was presented with a document designed to waive my right to file this complaint in exchange for my release." A pause of 1 second, clean controlled. These things happened not because one officer had a bad day. They happened because 18 months of documented stops produced no contraband, no charges, and no accountability. Because a body camera was deactivated 9 times under the same explanation that 9 times proved false. Because financial payments flowed from a private attorney to the officer conducting the stops with the consistency of a payroll schedule. That is not a single bad day. That is a machine. And the audit this panel has recommended will begin the work of documenting how the machine was built and who built it, and what it cost the people who were stopped on that road before I was. She sat down. The chamber was quiet in the way of a room that has just heard something it cannot unhear. The vote on the independent audit 5-2 in favor. The vote on the mandatory body camera policy amendment 6-1. Naomi wrote both outcomes in her notebook and put it away. Damon called on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after the council meeting. Naomi was at her desk. The second notebook was open in front of her, not to any specific page, just open the way you leave a book open when you know you're going to come back to it. He said there was a letter for her at his address. Handwritten. Return address was a Millhaven P.O. box. He had brought it with him to Atlanta that weekend, and it was sitting on her kitchen counter. She asked him to leave it there. She wasn't ready to open it yet, not because she didn't know who it was from, but because she did know, and because she had learned over the course of a career built on the discipline of sequence and evidence that some things needed to be opened at the right moment and not before. The investigation needed to reach its next milestone first. The audit needed to proceed. The criminal inquiry needed to find its footing. There was an order to things, and she had always trusted the order. She opened the letter on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. The envelope was plain. The handwriting on the front was small and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had started this letter more than once and wanted this version to count. "Ms. Voss," it read. "I've started this letter 4 times. I'm not sure I'll finish it this time either, but I'm going to try." I knew about the corridor stops before that afternoon. Not the financial part. I didn't know about Finch until the FOIA email came out. But I knew the stops were happening, and I knew they weren't right, and I didn't do anything more than carry water cups and leave a door open an inch. I keep thinking about what you said in the holding room. You said, "Write that down." You weren't talking to me. But I heard it. I wrote it down. I don't know if this letter is appropriate or useful. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I saw you. I saw what you did and how you did it. The notebook. The way you looked at his camera. The way you read that sign before you even stopped the car. I didn't know who you were. I still don't, not really. But I knew you weren't afraid. I hope you're well. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. D. Pruitt. Naomi read it once. She folded it back on its original creases and held it for a moment. Just held it the weight of 2 pages and the weight of what they represented, a young woman in a uniform who had carried water cups and checked camera indicators and left a door open an inch, and who had spent months turning that inch into something she could live with. She placed the letter in the second notebook between the first page and the second between the case number and the date 8 months before the stop. She picked up her pen. She wrote in the margin in the small handwriting she used for things she was still turning over Pruitt. "I knew you weren't afraid." She looked at the words for a moment. Then she wrote underneath them, smaller still. She was wrong about that. She capped the pen and closed the notebook and sat for a while at her desk in the Atlanta morning light, not writing anything, just sitting. Damon called again that same evening. "How are you?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it the way she didn't always. "Tired," she said. "Good kind or the other kind, both." He told her about a man who had come into Bernadette's diner the previous week from out of state, stopped on Corridor 14. 3 years ago, signed a settlement, had always felt in the specific and unresolvable way of someone who has signed away their right to speak about something they never should have been asked to be quiet about, that something had been taken from him that he was never going to get back. He had come to Millhaven because he had read the Courier piece and wanted to know if there was anyone he could talk to now. "I sent him to Webb," Damon said. "Good." A longer pause. Then Damon said, "There's something I haven't said." And she waited because she knew by the particular quality of the pause that this was not information. It was the other kind of thing, the kind that doesn't make the record but makes everything else possible. The first time he grabbed my collar, on the road, I kept thinking, don't react, don't give them anything, stay still, stay small, make yourself a wall. And I did. But it costs something doing that. Every single time it costs something, and nobody asks you to pay it, you just pay it. And most of the time no one ever knows you paid anything at all. The line was quiet for a moment. "I know that cost," Naomi said. "I've been paying it my whole career. I built a whole method around it. The notebook, the documentation, the cases, all of it is just me paying it in a way that makes something with it. But the cost is the same." "I know," he said. "I know it is." Neither of them said anything for a while after that, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that comes from two people having said the true thing and not needing to say anything more. "You did something that matters," he said finally. "We did," she said. "I just wrote it down." 7 months after the afternoon on Corridor 14, Naomi parked the Range Rover on the shoulder at mile marker 12. The same car. Damon had kept it, which was its own kind of statement, quiet and deliberate. The statement of two people who had decided that nothing about that afternoon was going to make them smaller than they had been before it. The Alabama heat was the same kind it had always been on this road, flat and iron-heavy, pressing down on the asphalt, making the air thick and alive in the way that demands acknowledgement. She got out and stood on the shoulder and looked at the posted notice on the metal stake near the guardrail. The old weathered card was gone. In its place was a new laminated notice, crisp and recent, printed on department letterhead, Millhaven County Police Department, Corridor 14, Notice. Pursuant to City Council Resolution 2024-47, all traffic stops on this corridor require mandatory body camera activation for the duration of the stop. Officers are required to state specific probable cause prior to initiating any detention. Citizens' rights under the Fourth Amendment are paramount to this department's mission. And below that, the contact information for internal affairs and the Community Oversight Committee, which had 3 civilian members. One of them was Bernadette Cole. Naomi read the notice once. She took a photograph of it. She wrote the date and time in her notebook, got back in the car, and drove north. In Gulf Shores, on the back porch of a house with a view of the Gulf, as a flat blue line at the edge of the horizon. Harold Finch sat with something cold in his hand, and his pension, and the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon that had stopped feeling entirely quiet some weeks ago. The criminal inquiry was still building. The audit had 6 weeks remaining. The sequence of things, the order that Naomi had always trusted, was moving in its slow and methodical way toward the moment when the approval chain would be traced backward to the name at the top of it. He did not know when that moment would come, but he had begun each morning to check the mail before he made his coffee, and he had begun each evening to sit a little longer on the back porch watching the Gulf, as if the distance of the water could put distance between him and what was coming. It couldn't. Nothing could. It was only a question of time, and in Naomi's experience, documented cases had a way of being patient that outlasted even the most determined waiting. On her desk in Atlanta, the second notebook sat closed. The city moved through its morning outside the window, indifferent and continuous and full of people going about the business of their days, unaware of the things that had happened on a road in Alabama, and the things that were still happening methodically and without fanfare in hearing rooms and audit offices, and the inbox of a federal prosecutor building a case one document at a time. Naomi opened the notebook to the last written page. She looked at the case number. She looked at the date, 8 months before the stop. She looked at authorization confirmed day 1. She looked at the words she had written in the margin. She was wrong about that. Then she picked up her pen and wrote one final line below everything else. Not a conclusion, not a summary, not the kind of ending that wraps things up and calls them finished, because she had been in this work long enough to know that nothing wraps up, and nothing is ever fully finished, only documented, only carried forward, only given enough light that the next person who needs it can find it. She wrote, still not finished, but it won't be lost again. She closed the notebook. She set it down. And she looked out the window at the city at the ordinary and relentless morning, and for the first time since mile marker 12, she did not write anything at all. Because some things don't need to be written down to be true, and some mornings the most important thing you can do is simply be present for them, whole, thorough, and without needing to look again. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Every view is a reminder that truth, when it's documented carefully enough, tends to survive.